The Biker Who Underestimated the Wrong Man, a tale of revenge and justice, the calm before the storm. The streets of Brooklyn Heights hummed with the usual midday buzz. Sunlight filtered through the trees that lined the sidewalks, casting dappled shadows on the busy passers-by. The city seemed to be alive with its unique rhythm and pulse, a world unto itself. In the midst of this urban landscape, there was an undeniable feeling of tranquility as Jack Sullivan strolled down the street, a quiet and serene figure amidst the chaos. Jack, with his signature sunglasses and a leather jacket that suggested an air of mystery, was known for keeping to himself. The famous actor had long since learned to enjoy his privacy despite his fame. He had built a career that kept him in the spotlight, but outside of work he sought peace, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Today he was simply Jack, the man who loved dogs, not the Hollywood star everyone knew from the big screen. Beside him walked Ace, his loyal pit bull, a dog who was far from ordinary. Ace wasn't just a pet, he was Jack's companion, his confidant, and his protector. With his sleek fur and muscular build, Ace exuded a quiet strength much like his owner. It wasn't often that Jack allowed anyone to walk alongside him on a quiet afternoon like this one, but Ace was different. The bond between them was unspoken, yet unbreakable. As they wandered down the familiar streets, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. This was the life he had always wanted, peaceful, solitary, with the love of a dog that never judged. They had no destination in mind, only the joy of the walk itself, the rhythmic sound of Ace's paws tapping against the pavement, and the quiet hum of city life surrounding them. They passed by several cafes, shops, and apartments, the sounds of chatter and laughter spilling out onto the streets. Jack's thoughts drifted back to his latest film. It had been a challenging project, physically demanding and emotionally draining, but it was also rewarding. He had a few days off now, a brief respite from the chaos of shooting. It was during these rare moments of solitude that he truly felt himself. Jack stopped in front of a small cafe with an outdoor seating area, its chalkboard sign advertising the daily specials in bright artistic letters. He gave Ace's leash a gentle tug, signaling it was time to take a break. Ace, who was always eager for a rest, sat down immediately, his tail wagging lazily as he looked up at Jack with expectant eyes. "All right, buddy," Jack said with a soft smile. "Let's grab a seat and cool off a bit." He approached an empty table under a canopy of ivy, securing Ace's leash to the chair before sitting down. As Jack settled in, he took a moment to observe the people around him. There were a few familiar faces, a couple of locals who frequented the cafe, a man reading a newspaper, a woman on her phone. Nothing out of the ordinary. The world seemed to move at a gentle pace, the type of pace that Jack cherished. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile, approached their table and greeted Jack warmly. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her tone friendly and casual. "I'll have a black coffee and a steak sandwich," Jack replied. "And if you don't mind, a small plate of your best cut for my friend here," he said, gesturing toward Ace, who was now eyeing the woman with interest. The barista chuckled, glancing down at Ace with a soft smile. "Of course. I'll make sure to treat him like a king," she said before heading back into the cafe. As Jack waited for their order, he found himself lost in thought. The quiet atmosphere, the warm sunshine, and the presence of Ace made him feel more at home than any red carpet or film set ever could. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could simply exist without the weight of the world on his shoulders. But as the seconds passed, Jack noticed something unusual. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, interrupting the otherwise peaceful environment. It wasn't the typical hum of city traffic. This was different. The roar of engines echoed off the surrounding buildings, drawing Jack's attention to the source. A group of bikers, all clad in leather vests and rough attire, rolled down the street. Their bikes were loud and imposing, a stark contrast to the calm demeanor of the cafe. They parked near the entrance, their engines growling to a stop, and one by one they dismounted, their boots clicking against the pavement as they sauntered toward the bar across the street. Jack's eyes narrowed as he observed them. There was a certain aggression in their movements, a cockiness that was hard to ignore. As they entered the bar, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the first time he had seen bikers in this area, but there was an unsettling vibe about this group. Ace, sensing his owner's discomfort, stood up and tugged gently at the leash, his body tense. Jack reached down to pat Ace's head, trying to reassure him, but his own unease grew. He had seen this kind of behavior before, aggressive, entitled men who believed they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. "Easy boy," Jack muttered under his breath. "Just a bunch of troublemakers." But as Jack stood to adjust Ace's leash, one of the bikers, a tall man with a mohawk and a fierce look in his eyes, turned around and locked eyes with Jack. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Jack felt a wave of tension surge through him. It was clear that the biker was sizing him up, probably wondering if Jack was a target or just another bystander. Jack didn't flinch. He knew how to handle himself in tense situations, but he had no desire to escalate things. He turned back to Ace, trying to calm himself and his dog, when suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his chest. The biker had just kicked Ace. The force of the kick sent Ace stumbling backward, a whimper escaping his throat as he tried to regain his footing. Jack's heart sank. His body moved on instinct, his anger flaring in a flash as he rushed to Ace's side. "Hey, Jack!" shouted, his voice firm and commanding. The biker turned around, a sneer curling on his lips. "What's the problem, pretty boy?" "It's just a dog," he said, his voice laced with mockery. But Jack was beyond words. His protective instinct for Ace, combined with the surge of adrenaline, ignited something deep inside him. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. The group of bikers stopped in their tracks, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "You don't touch my dog," Jack said, his voice low and controlled, though every word dripped with anger. The biker chuckled darkly, his hands resting on his hips. "And what are you gonna do about it?" he taunted. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down next to Ace, checking for any visible signs of injury. Ace's eyes were wide, his body trembling, but there didn't seem to be any immediate damage. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but the anger inside him was far from quelled. "I said you don't touch my dog," Jack repeated, standing up straight and locking eyes with the biker once more. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, the tension between them palpable. The bikers, sensing a confrontation brewing, exchanged glances, but none of them moved. "Leave," Jack commanded, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even himself. The biker stared at him, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a mocking grin, he turned and walked back into the bar. But not before muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." Jack stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The adrenaline slowly drained from his body, but the anger remained simmering just beneath the surface. He glanced down at Ace, who was now sitting patiently at his feet, his tail wagging slightly. "Don't worry, boy," Jack whispered, rubbing Ace's head. "We're not done here." The biker's threat. The aftermath of the confrontation hung in the air like the stifling humidity of Brooklyn Heights, thick and unresolved. Jack stood motionless for a few moments, his eyes following the biker who had kicked Ace before retreating into the bar. The words of the biker echoed in his mind. This isn't over. The challenge, the mockery, it all stirred something primal within Jack, something more than just anger. It was a deep, visceral sense of injustice. He had never tolerated bullies, never stood by when someone innocent was threatened. But today, this was more than just a casual act of cruelty. This was personal. Ace, ever the stoic companion, had recovered quickly. He was used to Jack's quiet but intense presence, and he knew when his owner's attention was fully on him. The dog's deep brown eyes gazed up at Jack, his posture calm, yet a certain wariness remained, the sting of the biker's cruelty still lingering in the air. "All right, buddy," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, though his jaw was clenched tight. "Let's get out of here." The cafe, which had once felt like a safe retreat, now felt alien, charged with an energy that Jack couldn't shake. He didn't want to make a scene, but it was clear to him now this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a part of something bigger. Jack knew what kind of people ran in biker gangs, and the reckless arrogance they exuded wasn't just for show. There was always violence, always the threat of something far worse lurking just beneath the surface. Jack's heart raced as he made his way to the door, his thoughts still circling the events of the last few minutes. He had seen the biker's vest, a jagged tiger's claw insignia, unmistakable in its design. It wasn't a common logo. Jack had encountered it before on a previous film set when he had worked on a movie involving organized crime. He recognized that emblem as part of a notorious local gang that had long been a blight on the Brooklyn area. The gang was known for its intimidation tactics, smuggling, and violence. They didn't care about the rules of society, they made their own. "Let's go home, Ace," Jack muttered to the dog, though his mind was far from settled. As Jack and Ace stepped into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the cafe, Jack felt the eyes of the patrons on him. They had witnessed the scene, and he could feel their discomfort, the unsaid words floating in the air. He didn't need their sympathy, but it gnawed at him that people like the bikers made everyone feel powerless. Maggie, the waitress who had greeted him earlier, came out to check on him. Her usual cheerful expression had softened, and her brows were furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked in a low voice, the tension of the situation reflected in her eyes. "I'm fine," Jack said, his voice steady but weary. "I'm sorry about the commotion." He could tell she was on edge, and he didn't want to burden her further. He wasn't sure how much she knew about the bikers or their influence in the neighborhood, but from the way she had handled the previous altercation, he suspected she knew more than she let on. "No need to apologize," Maggie replied, her voice a little more firm now, as if she had made up her mind about something. "Those guys have been causing problems around here for weeks. I'm sorry about your dog, though. That wasn't right." She paused, her gaze shifting to Ace, who had curled up by Jack's feet, resting but still alert. Jack met her gaze, his jaw tightening slightly. He didn't want to dwell on what had just happened, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this was more than just an unfortunate encounter. There was something dangerous about these bikers. The fact that they had been harassing the cafe for weeks meant they had a sense of ownership over the area, a grip on it that people like Maggie and Jack were not meant to disturb. "I'm going to take care of it," Jack said, his voice low but with a sense of finality. He could see Maggie's eyes widen slightly, but she didn't argue. She didn't have to. He wasn't asking for permission. The instinct to protect Ace and now the rest of the people who might be at risk burned in his chest like fire. Jack stepped out of the cafe with a new resolve. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was determined. The thought of a man or a group of men feeling like they had the right to kick a defenseless animal to destroy the peace of the community filled him with a sense of righteous fury. This wasn't just about Ace anymore. This was about making sure they didn't get away with it. But Jack was no fool. He knew that confronting a gang of bikers, especially one as violent as the Tiger Claw group, head-on would be a mistake. He wasn't some hot-headed vigilante. He was an actor, a man who had trained his whole life to stay calm under pressure. He had learned through years of experience to make calculated decisions. As Jack made his way back toward his apartment, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He had to figure out the right course of action. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further or get anyone else involved. But the bikers were a different story. If they were willing to hurt Ace, who knew what they were capable of. Jack arrived at his building, but he didn't go inside right away. Instead, he stood at the entrance thinking. He needed information. More than anything, Jack knew that knowledge was power. He needed to understand these bikers, understand what they wanted, why they felt untouchable. That's when he remembered Sheriff Hank Morrison. Jack had known Hank for years. They'd worked together on a few community outreach programs. Hank was tough but fair, and he had the kind of connections that could help Jack get to the heart of the biker gang's activities. It wasn't just about getting justice for Ace, it was about making sure these criminals didn't hurt anyone else. With a sense of urgency, Jack pulled out his phone and dialed Hank's number. The phone rang a few times before Hank picked up. Hank's voice came through rough but familiar. "What's going on? I need your help," Jack said without preamble. "It's about a biker gang in Brooklyn Heights. They've been harassing the locals, and today they kicked my dog. I need to know who they are and what we can do to stop them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jack could hear Hank's breathing grow deeper, more deliberate. "Hold tight, Jack." Hank finally said, his tone low. "I'll look into it. You did the right thing calling me." Jack exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. He knew he could count on Hank. This wasn't just about Ace anymore, it was about ensuring justice for the community that had been terrorized by this group for far too long. "I'll be waiting," Jack replied, his voice steady but resolute. "And Hank, keep this between us for now. I don't want this getting out." Hank's response was a low chuckle. "You've got it, Jack. I'll keep you updated." The call ended and Jack leaned against the wall outside his building. The events of the day had already taken a toll on him. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The threat was real and it wasn't going to go away on its own. Jack couldn't just stand by. He had to make sure that the bikers who had hurt Ace were held accountable. But Jack wasn't going to take matters into his own hands recklessly. He was smarter than that. He would wait for Hank's update. He would stay patient. For now, all he could do was watch over Ace and prepare for the next steps in this strange, unexpected battle. The gathering storm. The days following the encounter at the cafe felt like a blur to Jack. Despite his outward calm, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about the bikers, about the violence they represented, and most of all about Ace, whose playful nature had been so brutally disrupted. Jack's focus was fractured, his patience wearing thin as the events of that afternoon gnawed at him. There was a dark, festering wound in the pit of his stomach, one that urged him to act, to do something, anything to restore balance. Ace, ever the loyal companion, was the only comfort in these restless hours. The dog had settled into a new rhythm despite the incident. He was as playful as ever, his tail wagging furiously whenever Jack returned home, the initial trauma from the kick seeming to fade in the dog's mind. But Jack knew better. Ace, like any dog, could forget a moment's cruelty, but Jack couldn't. It was early the next morning when Hank's call came in. Jack had been up late going through his notes and scribbling down possible leads on the biker gang. He'd already visited a few local shops to gather information, but it was like pulling teeth. No one wanted to talk about the bikers, especially not openly. There were rumors, but nothing solid. The Tiger Claw gang had everyone in Brooklyn Heights on edge. "Jack, it's Hank." The sheriff's voice came through sharp and to the point. "I've got some information. You were right to be concerned. These guys aren't just troublemakers, they've got a much larger operation going on." Jack straightened, the sound of Hank's voice instantly making his pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What exactly are we dealing with here?" "Well," Hank continued after running a few checks, "I found out the Tiger Claw gang's been involved in a number of illegal activities, everything from smuggling to extortion. It's not just random violence. They've been using their bikes to transport illicit goods in and out of the city for years. And guess who's behind it all?" Hank paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Jack held his breath. "Who?" Hank's voice dropped to a grim tone. "A man named Vince the Viper Delgado. He's been at the top for a long time. Most of the bikers are just his foot soldiers, but he's the one running the show. And now that I've seen the insignia, I can tell you those guys you've been dealing with. They're under his command." Jack's fingers clenched into fists. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they created was one he wasn't sure he was ready for. "So these bikers, they've been running a criminal enterprise all along," exactly, Hank confirmed, "and they're not going to back down. I'd say you've got two options. Wait for me to handle it through the proper channels or get involved yourself. But make no mistake, Jack, this isn't just some small-time gang. These guys are dangerous." Jack's mind raced. He'd known the bikers weren't ordinary troublemakers, but he hadn't realized the full scope of their operation. "How do we stop them?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of determination and frustration. "We're working on a plan, but we need more evidence," Hank replied. "I've got a few officers gathering intel, but it's going to take time. They're slippery, and they know how to cover their tracks. In the meantime, stay low, keep an eye out, and keep Ace safe. This is bigger than just you and the dog. It's about putting an end to their whole operation." Jack took a deep breath. It was as if everything had suddenly become much more complicated. What had started as a simple act of cruelty against his dog had now escalated into a full-blown criminal investigation. But Jack wasn't going to back down. His thoughts immediately returned to Ace. The dog was his responsibility now, and he couldn't allow anyone to harm him again. Later that afternoon, Jack found himself standing outside the bar once again, this time with Ace by his side. The Tiger Claws weren't here now, but Jack could feel their presence lingering in the air like a storm that hadn't yet passed. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street, and the atmosphere had a thick, oppressive quality. It wasn't just about Ace anymore. This had become personal. The bikers had kicked his dog for no reason other than their own twisted amusement. They thought they could get away with it. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen. He turned to Ace, who was sniffing around the street, seemingly unbothered by the tension in the air. Jack crouched down next to him, his voice soft but firm. "We're going to fix this, buddy. I promise you that." The quiet evening was broken by the sudden roar of motorcycle engines, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. The Tiger Claws were back. He recognized the rumble of their bikes from earlier, and this time there was more than just the usual noise. There were more bikes, more men, and more power behind it all. Jack's gut twisted in anticipation. The bikers roared past, their laughter filling the street as they careened down the block. Jack's gaze followed them, and that's when he saw him, the one who had kicked Ace. He was at the head of the pack, leading the charge. The man wore the same tiger insignia on his vest, a sharp reminder of just how dangerous this gang really was. Jack didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the man, his fists tightening as he stood there in the fading light. The adrenaline surged through him, a mix of anger and resolve. This wasn't over. He knew it. The man who had hurt Ace, he would pay for what he had done. As the bikers disappeared around the corner, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Hank. "Jack, listen." Hank's voice came through urgently. "I've got something for you. It's not much, but I found out Vince Delgado's got a meet set up tomorrow night. He'll be with some of his guys at a warehouse out by the docks. If you want to make a move, that's your best chance." Jack's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. But even as the words left Hank's mouth, Jack knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a mission of vengeance anymore. This was about justice. For Ace, for the people who had suffered under the bikers' reign of terror, and for the community that had been too afraid to fight back. "I'll be there," Jack said firmly. "Thanks, Hank. I won't let them get away with this." The hours leading up to that night felt interminable. Jack didn't waste time brooding or preparing for battle in any traditional sense. Instead, he spent the time focusing on what he knew best, being calm, calculated, and patient. He knew his strength wasn't just in his physicality. He had learned over the years that his mind was just as powerful. The key was strategy, understanding his environment, and knowing when to strike. By the time the sun had fully set, Jack was ready. He was dressed in all black, blending in with the shadows, a far cry from the Hollywood actor people recognized. His hands were steady as he checked his gear, a few basic tools, a flashlight, a cell phone, and a backup gun just in case. Ace was resting at home, safe for now, and Jack made a silent vow to return to him alive and with justice served. As he approached the warehouse, the world around him seemed to narrow into a single point of focus. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of a distant engine. The docks were dark, illuminated only by a few flickering streetlights and the dull glow from the warehouse itself. Jack's heartbeat thrummed in his ears, a constant reminder of the stakes. He took a deep breath and moved forward, blending with the night. The showdown at the docks. The night was thick with tension as Jack moved closer to the warehouse at the docks. The cool night air seemed to carry the weight of something inevitable. His heart beat steadily in his chest, but there was no mistaking the sense of anticipation that ran through his veins. This was the moment everything had led to this. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette outlined against the night sky. The distant sound of waves crashing against the pier was a sharp contrast to the muted growl of motorcycles idling nearby. Jack moved silently, his boots making no sound against the concrete. He knew this area well. Brooklyn's docks had seen many shady deals over the years, but nothing like what was about to unfold tonight. The bikers had to be inside their loud engines and aggressive nature, too bold to hide for long. But the question that lingered in Jack's mind was how many of them were inside. He didn't know who to trust, or even if anyone could be trusted. The only certainty was that Vince the Viper Delgado, the gang's leader, was inside, and Jack had every intention of confronting him. This wasn't just about Ace anymore. It was about taking down an operation that had terrorized the community for years. Jack wasn't afraid of Vince or his gang, but the unpredictability of the situation made everything more dangerous. He crouched low, peering through the broken slats of the warehouse's side door. The flickering lights inside created an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor. Jack could see several bikers milling about inside their heavy boots, echoing against the metal walls as they drank, laughed, and talked in low voices. In the corner, a few men were stacking crates, their faces half obscured by the dim light. There were no women, no children, just hardened men who dealt in violent smuggling and worse. Jack's hand instinctively went to the handle of the knife tucked into his boot, a sharp reminder that he had to be ready for anything. He had to move quickly and decisively. But more than anything, Jack had to remember that this wasn't a one-man mission. This was about the community, about Ace, and about the future of Brooklyn Heights. Taking a deep breath, Jack moved to the back of the warehouse. The entrance was guarded, but there was a small alleyway around the side that led to an unmarked back door. Jack had done his homework. He knew there was a secondary entrance hidden from view, perfect for an unexpected entry. As he approached the door, a voice came from the darkness behind him, looking for something. Jack's muscles tensed, his body instinctively turning toward the voice, but he relaxed when he saw who it was. Hank. The sheriff was standing just behind him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp with purpose. He was dressed in dark clothing, blending in with the night just like Jack. It wasn't a coincidence that Hank had shown up. The sheriff had been monitoring the situation, making sure Jack wasn't alone in this dangerous moment. But even with Hank's backup, Jack knew the risks. "You couldn't wait until backup arrived, huh?" Hank said with a smirk, stepping closer. "I get it, though. We're all feeling the heat now." Jack gave him a brief nod, his jaw tightening. "I'm not waiting anymore. They kicked my dog, Hank. These guys are making a mockery of this whole neighborhood. It ends tonight." Hank's expression grew more serious. "You're right. But remember, these aren't just thugs. They're connected. Vince Delgado's not just some random criminal, Jack. He's got ties. Big ones. And if you go in there without thinking things through, I'm thinking..." Jack cut in, his voice firm. "I've thought about this for days. I know exactly what I'm doing." Hank hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, let's go then. You know the drill. I'll handle the law, you handle them." With that, the two men moved silently into the warehouse. Inside, the smell of alcohol and motor oil hit Jack almost immediately. The bikers were rowdy, gathered around crates of what looked like stolen goods, talking in hushed tones. At the far side of the room, Vince Delgado was sitting on a high stool, a cold beer in his hand, his signature tiger claw patch glistening under the dim light. He was flanked by a few of his most loyal followers, men who looked like they'd seen more fights than Jack cared to count. Jack's eyes locked onto Vince. There was something cold and calculating about the man, something that made the air around him heavier. It was clear that he wasn't just a thug, he was the orchestrator of something much larger. Hank nudged Jack and whispered, "I'll take care of the front. You focus on Delgado." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He gave Hank a single nod and the sheriff disappeared into the shadows, a quiet figure ready to make his move. Jack moved forward, his steps measured and purposeful. "Vince Delgado," Jack's voice rang out in the warehouse, cutting through the clatter of conversations. The bikers turned their eyes, narrowing as they sized up the intruder. Vince, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap, looked up slowly. A slow grin spread across his face as he recognized Jack. Well, Vince said, his voice deep and gravelly. "The man who thinks he can walk into my territory and play hero. I heard about you, Jack. You're the one with the dog, right? You and your pit bull. What's it gonna be, huh? You come here to settle scores?" Jack's eyes locked with Vince's. He wasn't intimidated, but there was something unsettling in Vince's gaze, a hunger, an arrogance. The room seemed to grow colder. "Yeah," Jack said slowly. "I'm here to settle this. What happened to Ace, and what you've been doing to this neighborhood, it ends now." The laughter from the group of bikers turned to silence. They were watching, waiting for Vince to respond. Jack could feel the tension building in the room. Vince's grin widened. "You've got a lot of guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean a damn thing when you're dealing with men like me. And as for your dog, he's not worth your time. What I did was just a little lesson. You should have kept him on a leash." Before Jack could retort, a figure moved toward him from the shadows. One of the bikers, a massive man with tattoos covering his arms and neck, stepped forward. He had a baseball bat in his hand, and the gleam in his eyes suggested that he was eager to take Jack down. The room shifted. The bikers were circling slowly, closing in on Jack. "You want to save that dog, huh?" the biker sneered. "I'll show you what happens to people who think they can walk in here and start giving orders." Jack's instincts kicked in. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. His fingers twitched, and in the blink of an eye, he was moving. With one swift motion, he sidestepped the oncoming swing of the bat, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back, forcing him to drop the weapon with a loud clang. The room gasped as Jack effortlessly subdued the larger man, who let out a yelp of pain. But before anyone could react, Jack's eyes flicked back to Vince, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression of cold amusement. "Who's next?" Jack asked, his voice icy, his heart racing with the adrenaline coursing through him. Vince's grin disappeared. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He could see that Jack wasn't just some actor playing a part, he was the real deal. But even as Jack prepared for what would come next, he knew the stakes were high. The bikers weren't just going to roll over. The fight had just begun. The fight for justice. The warehouse was now an arena of tension. The cool air had been replaced by the thick warmth of impending violence, and every sound, the clang of metal, the scrape of boots across concrete, seemed to reverberate off the walls. Jack could feel the atmosphere shift, the bikers tightening their circle around him. But there was no going back now. He had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to back down. Not after everything that had happened to Ace. Vince stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the dim light of the warehouse. His gang of bikers looked to him for direction, but Vince didn't give them an order. Instead, he looked directly at Jack with cold, calculating eyes. "Nice move back there, pretty quick," Vince drawled, his voice rough, but with an undertone of respect. "But you're still outnumbered, Jack. You're in my world now. And in my world, things don't go the way you think they should." Jack's muscles were tense, his heart racing as the reality of the situation set in. There was no way he was walking out of here unscathed, but he was prepared. He had trained for moments like this, moments when action, not words, decided the outcome. And right now, his mind was sharp, his focus clear. This was it. No more hesitation. Outnumbered or not. "It's over," Vince, Jack said with a calmness that belied the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Your gang is done. You've terrorized this community long enough, and I'm here to make sure you never get to do it again." Vince let out a short, cruel laugh. "You're funny, Jack. But here's the thing, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't just about a dog. You want to make this personal, fine, but you're not walking out of here tonight." Jack's eyes never left Vince's. He could see the danger, the readiness to fight, but he also saw something else, fear. Vince's cocky facade was starting to crack just a little. The uncertainty Jack had seen earlier was still there, lingering beneath the surface. At that moment, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of another motorcycle revving up. It was loud, the roar of the engine cutting through the tension like a knife. The sound echoed across the warehouse, and Jack's mind raced. He had no doubt that this was no ordinary rider. This was the backup Vince had called in, and Jack had a sinking feeling that it was going to make everything much worse. Before Jack could react, the warehouse door swung open. The group of bikers parted like the Red Sea, and in strode a massive figure, a man clad in black leather, his helmet tucked under his arm. This wasn't just any biker. This was someone even Vince feared. Jack recognized him immediately. Razor, one of the most feared enforcers in the city. His reputation was legendary, his hands stained with the blood of many, his presence enough to make most men cower. Razor's eyes immediately locked onto Jack. The menacing figure gave him a once-over, his eyes narrowing as if deciding whether or not Jack was worth his time. Then without a word, Razor moved toward Jack, his boots thudding against the concrete floor. The others in the room stepped back, sensing the shift in power. Vince, who had been watching the interaction closely, said nothing, but Jack could feel the change in the air. Razor was here for one reason: to settle things in a way that would make the biker gang's message loud and clear. Jack Razor said, his voice low and grating like gravel being ground underfoot. "You really think you can walk in here and tear down what we've built? You're not even part of this world. You don't know what it takes to survive here." Jack didn't flinch, his eyes never leaving Razor's. "I don't need to know your world, Razor. I just need to know that you and your crew aren't going to hurt anyone else." Razor's lips curled into a wicked grin. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery doesn't win wars, Jack. You know what wins wars." He took a step closer, his shadow looming over Jack. Power, money, and fear. With that, Razor threw a punch fast and brutal, aimed squarely at Jack's head. But Jack was ready. He ducked at the last moment, feeling the rush of wind as Razor's fist whizzed past his ear. He countered with a swift kick to Razor's knee, the move sending a sharp pain shooting up the enforcer's leg. Razor staggered back, a growl of frustration escaping his lips. "Not bad," Razor grunted, rubbing his knee. "But it's going to take more than that to take me down." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he launched himself at Razor, using his momentum to tackle the much larger man to the ground. The impact echoed in the warehouse as the two collided, rolling across the cold concrete. For a few moments, it was just a blur of fists, boots, and leather. The bikers stood around the two men, watching the fight unfold with a mix of interest and wariness. They knew Razor's reputation, and they knew that Jack wasn't giving up without a fight. But Jack wasn't just fighting for revenge. This was more than that. This was about protecting the community, about showing Vince and his gang that they had no right to terrorize anyone. Razor roared in anger, trying to grab Jack by the collar, but Jack ducked under him, bringing Razor to the ground with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The air in the warehouse seemed to grow colder as the two men grappled, each struggling for dominance. Razor was strong, but Jack was faster. And that speed made all the difference. In the midst of their fight, Jack felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. A voice shouted from the back of the room, one that Jack immediately recognized. Enough. It was Vince. The room fell silent. The bikers retreating into the shadows, their attention now fixed on their leader. Vince stepped forward, his eyes hardening as he watched the two men fight. But there was no amusement in his gaze now, only the cold, calculating look of someone who realized his control was slipping. "You think this is how it's going to end?" Vince sneered. "You think you can just take us down like this, Jack? This is my territory. You're not walking out of here. And if you think Razor's bad, you have no idea what's waiting for you." Jack, breathing heavily, wiped the sweat from his brow. He was exhausted, but he wasn't backing down. "I'm done with your threats, Vince. Your gang has caused enough damage. This ends now." Vince's expression twisted with anger, but he said nothing more. Instead, he made a subtle motion with his hand, signaling to his men. The bikers around the room began to close in again, surrounding Jack from every direction. For a moment, Jack felt the weight of the situation. But then through the door, a figure stepped forward, cutting through the tension with the grace and poise of someone who belonged. It was Hank, the sheriff. "All right, enough of this nonsense." Hank's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "We've got the whole place surrounded. No one moves." Jack felt a surge of relief as Hank's men flooded into the warehouse, their guns drawn, their movements swift and coordinated. The bikers hesitated, their hands slowly reaching for their weapons, but the sheriff's voice rang out again, calm but authoritative. "Drop your weapons," Hank ordered. "You're done." The law is here now. The bikers were cornered. The realization that they were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options was clear in their eyes. Vince and Razor exchanged a quick glance, their bravado faltering for just a moment. But it was enough. The gang's dominance had crumbled. As Vince and Razor were taken into custody, Jack couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't over, not yet, but this was a victory, a step closer to restoring peace to Brooklyn Heights. He glanced at Hank, who gave him a brief nod, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and something else. Something unspoken. "You did good, Jack," Hank said quietly, stepping over to him. "Real good." Jack nodded, his eyes focused on the bikers being led out of the warehouse. "It's not over yet, Hank. There's still work to do." But for the moment, Jack allowed himself to breathe. He had taken the first step in ensuring that the streets were safe again and that Ace's memory wasn't in vain. He could already feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. As the last of the bikers were taken away, Jack turned to Hank. "Let's go get Ace," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is just the beginning." The unforeseen consequence. The morning sun shone through the windows of the old police station in Brooklyn Heights, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Jack stood near the counter, his fingers lightly tapping the edge as he waited for Hank to finish speaking with one of the officers. The weight of the previous day's events still hung heavy on his shoulders. It was hard to shake off the adrenaline that had coursed through his veins the night before the violence, the confrontation with the bikers, the overwhelming sense of responsibility for Ace. But there was no time to rest. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hank emerged from the back office, his face creased with concern. As the sheriff walked up to Jack, his usually calm demeanor seemed more worn. "We've got a problem," Hank said, his voice low and serious. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Hank leaned in closer, lowering his voice further. "It's Vince. He's not going to go down without a fight. I've got a feeling this isn't just about the bikers anymore. They're going to start retaliating. They've got connections, Jack. Connections that run deep." Jack's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much. Even though Vince and his gang were now behind bars, Jack knew the real war was just beginning. The bikers' network wasn't just a group of rebels on motorcycles. It was a complex, dangerous organization with fingers in every aspect of Brooklyn's underworld. "Any idea what they're planning?" Jack asked, keeping his voice steady despite the worry gnawing at him. Hank glanced around the room to make sure they weren't overheard before continuing. "I've had some sources telling me that Vince has been in touch with people who could make things difficult for you, Jack. You've made a powerful enemy and the repercussions aren't going to end here. If we don't move fast, you might find yourself in deeper trouble than you expected." Jack exhaled slowly. He had expected some kind of retaliation, but hearing it confirmed made it all feel more real. His fingers curled into a fist at his side, his jaw clenching. He wasn't going to back down now, not when Ace's safety and his own sense of justice were on the line. "I can't let them get away with it," Jack muttered more to himself than to Hank. He wasn't going to live in fear, not after everything he had fought for. "I don't expect you to," Hank replied, his voice resolute. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't take them on alone." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You have a plan." Hank's lips curled into a tight smile. "I do, actually." The plan was simple, yet incredibly risky. They would use Vince's connections to get a lead on the biker gang's next move. Hank had reached out to a few reliable sources who could help track the movements of the bikers and provide information on any potential threats. But Jack had a feeling the real breakthrough wouldn't come from the police. It would come from the people who had witnessed the gang's violence firsthand, the ones who lived in the shadows, the ones who had something to gain from the bikers' fall. For now, Jack knew he had to stay focused. The bikers weren't the only threat. His next priority was to check on Ace and ensure that the dog's recovery was going as planned. He couldn't afford to lose focus now, not with everything that had happened. As much as he wanted to dive into the battle with the bikers head first, he couldn't forget why he started this fight in the first place, Ace. Jack stood up and slapped the folder containing the latest police reports on the table. "Let's move," he said, his voice filled with determination. The drive to the veterinary clinic felt longer than it should have. Jack's mind kept racing through the events of the last few days. The confrontation at the biker bar, the arrests, the aftermath, everything was happening so quickly it was hard to process. He glanced over at Hank, who sat quietly in the passenger seat, his expression unreadable. The sheriff wasn't a man who wore his emotions on his sleeve, but Jack could sense the tension in the air. The situation had escalated quickly, and no one was sure where it would lead. "Have you been able to get in touch with the vet?" Jack asked, his eyes flicking to Hank briefly before returning to the road. Hank nodded. "Yeah. They've been in touch with me. Buddy's stable, but they're still monitoring him. The poison in his system was potent, Jack. We got lucky, but we can't let our guard down. He's going to need a lot of care to make a full recovery." Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, the tension in his hands mirroring the anxiety in his chest. He had seen Buddy at the clinic the night before, hooked up to machines still vulnerable. It had been a hard sight to bear. Jack had never felt such a deep connection to an animal before, but with Buddy it felt different. They had been through this together. The dog was more than just a companion for the movie. He had become a symbol of Jack's fight of everything he was standing up against. The veterinary clinic was a calm oasis amidst the chaos. The hustle and bustle of Brooklyn Heights felt miles away as Jack and Hank entered through the glass doors. The familiar scent of antiseptic and animal food filled the air, and the quiet hum of machinery provided a sense of comfort, as if the clinic was its own world separated from the chaos outside. A nurse greeted them at the counter, offering a warm professional smile. "Mr. Turner, Sheriff Morrison, I'm glad to see you again. Buddy's doing better. We've stabilized him, but he's still in a delicate condition." Jack let out a sigh of relief. At least that was good news. "Can I see him?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The need to be near Buddy to see him with his own eyes was overwhelming. The nurse nodded. "Of course, follow me." As they walked down the corridor toward the recovery room, Jack's mind wandered to the bikers again. What would Vince do next? How long would it take for them to regroup and strike again? His thoughts were interrupted when they reached the door to Buddy's room. The sight of the dog lying on the soft bed, his chest rising and falling gently as he breathed, brought a wave of relief to Jack. Buddy's eyes were closed, but there was a sense of peace about him. He was alive. He was going to make it. Hank stood quietly by the door, giving Jack the space he needed. Jack knelt beside the bed and gently stroked Buddy's head, his heart swelling with emotion. "You're gonna be okay, Buddy," Jack whispered. "We're going to get through this, together." The next few days passed in a blur of calls, meetings, and preparations. Jack and Hank worked together, using every resource they had to track down the remnants of Vince's gang. They followed leads, interrogated anyone who might have information, and watched every corner of the neighborhood for signs of retaliation. It was exhausting, but Jack knew they couldn't afford to rest. They had to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, Buddy's recovery continued. Every visit to the clinic brought new signs of improvement, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Buddy was strong, stronger than Jack had ever imagined. The dog had been through hell and back, but here he was fighting with everything he had. And as the days went by, Jack's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for Buddy anymore, he was fighting for the community, for justice, and for everything that was good in the world. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The phone call came late one evening, just as Jack was preparing for another sleepless night. It was Hank. "We've got a lead," Hank said, his voice tight with urgency. "We found out where Vince is hiding. You need to get down here now." Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "I'm on my way," Jack said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. This was his chance to end it all, to bring Vince down once and for all. The final showdown was about to begin. The final showdown. The city of Brooklyn Heights, usually bustling with the vibrant energy of busy streets and eager pedestrians, now felt like a battleground. The once lively corners were now filled with a palpable tension. It was as though every streetlight, every shadow whispered the promise of a looming confrontation. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, the final chapter in this war against Vince and his biker gang. It was just past midnight when Jack pulled up to the dilapidated building, the location Hank had given him. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the neighborhood looked like a forgotten relic of Brooklyn's industrial past. Tall, rusted gates creaked in the night breeze, and broken windows stared out like hollow eyes. The area was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a few motorcycles revving in the distance. Jack's heart was pounding as he approached the entrance, his eyes scanning every corner. His hand instinctively brushed over the gun holstered at his side, a small comfort in this uneasy situation. Hank had assured him that backup was coming, but Jack knew better than to rely on anyone but himself. This fight had become deeply personal. As he walked closer to the warehouse, he saw the familiar flash of motorcycles, Vince's gang no doubt lined up against the building. The rumble of their engines filled the air, mixing with the sounds of crackling tires on the dirt path. Jack could almost taste the hostility, thick as smoke in the air. Jack paused just outside the door, his hand on the handle. The adrenaline coursing through him was a sharp contrast to the quiet stillness of the night. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open with quiet precision. The warehouse was dark inside, save for a few flickering lights that cast long shadows across the floor. The space was vast, its high ceiling barely visible in the gloom. The low murmur of voices echoed around him, punctuated by the occasional thud of boots on the concrete. There, standing near a stack of crates, was Vince. The sight of him sent a flare of anger through Jack's chest. Vince was smug. His arms crossed, his typical grin plastered on his face as if he knew the entire situation was under his control. He wasn't alone. His gang was spread out throughout the room, lounging on motorcycles and leaning against the rusted walls, their eyes hard and predatory. They had the numbers, but Jack had the resolve. "You should have stayed out of this." Turner Vince's voice boomed through the room, drawing the attention of the other bikers. His words dripped with malice, and his smile grew wider as if savoring the upcoming chaos. But now it's too late. Jack stood tall, his body tense as he took a few steps further into the room. His voice was steady, low, and full of resolve. "You made it personal when you went after Buddy. I'm here to end it, Vince. No more games." Vince chuckled, a cold, humorless sound that bounced off the concrete walls. "You really think you can take me down, huh? You're just one man, and you're standing in my house." Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't flinch even as the bikers gathered closer, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. They could sense the tension in the air. Everyone was waiting for the spark to ignite the powder keg. "I don't need to take you down, Vince," Jack said, stepping forward, his eyes locking with Vince's. "You've already done the work for me. All I have to do is watch you fall." At that moment, Hank and the rest of the police backup arrived, their cars pulling into the parking lot outside. The sudden screech of tires and the flash of lights caught the bikers off guard. Panic flashed across their faces as they turned toward the door, but it was too late. The trap had been set. Vince's grin faltered. "What the hell is this?" He began to take a step back, but it was too late. Officers poured into the warehouse with the precision of a well-rehearsed routine. Guns raised, they moved swiftly, securing the bikers and rounding them up. "You're under arrest," Hank's voice cut through the chaos, commanding and sure, "for assault, drug trafficking, and animal cruelty." Vince's face twisted in fury as he tried to fight back, but the officers swiftly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground. The rest of the bikers stood no chance, their movements slow and panicked as they were surrounded by armed officers. Jack stood back, watching the scene unfold, a sense of satisfaction bubbling in his chest. As the officers secured the gang, Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The battle was over. Vince and his gang were going down. The neighborhood would finally be free of their reign of terror. But there was still one thing left to do. Jack approached Vince, who was being roughly dragged to his feet by two officers. Vince's eyes blazed with fury as he saw Jack walking toward him, his face contorted with rage. "You think you've won, Turner?" Vince spat the words, dripping with venom. "This is just the beginning. You'll regret this." Jack's gaze was steady, unwavering. "You're done, Vince. You've been terrorizing this neighborhood for far too long. You hurt the wrong people this time." He leaned down, his face close to Vince's. "You hurt my dog, and for that you'll pay." Vince tried to lunge at him, but the officers held him back, restraining him with brutal efficiency. Jack stood tall, his eyes never leaving Vince's face. This wasn't just about Buddy anymore. It was about justice, about making sure that the people who had terrorized this community were held accountable. As the bikers were loaded into police vehicles, Jack turned his back on Vince, walking away with Hank and the officers, his heart still pounding in his chest. The tension of the past few days seemed to melt away with each step, but Jack knew this wasn't the end. The fight had been won, but the consequences would ripple through the neighborhood for weeks to come. The following morning, Jack stood outside the veterinary clinic, his eyes focused on the door. The sun had just risen, casting a warm glow over the city as he waited for Buddy's recovery to be confirmed. He had done his part. He had faced Vince head-on, secured the safety of the community, and ensured that the people who had wronged him would pay the price. But none of that mattered without Buddy. He had come to care for the dog in ways he never expected. They had been through so much together. Jack was ready for Buddy to come home to continue their journey side by side. No more fights, no more fear. The door opened and the nurse came out, her smile wide and genuine. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Buddy's awake and he's doing great. He's stable and the worst is behind him. You can see him now." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Inside the clinic, Buddy was resting on a comfortable bed, his fur clean and free from the remnants of the previous night's struggles. He looked up as Jack approached, his tail thumping softly against the bed. Jack knelt down beside him, running a hand gently over his head. "You made it, Buddy. You're gonna be okay. I told you we'd get through this together." Buddy let out a soft bark, his eyes full of trust and affection. Jack's heart swelled with pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for. They were both going to be okay. As Jack and Buddy left the clinic, the streets of Brooklyn Heights seemed to welcome them back. The neighborhood felt safer, more alive, as if the weight of the past few days had lifted. The sun was shining brightly and the bustling streets no longer felt threatening. Jack smiled, knowing that the journey he had embarked on, both with Buddy and against Vince's gang, had changed him. The bond they shared was undeniable, and now together they would continue to walk these streets side by side in a world that finally felt a little bit safer. The morning after Buddy's release from the clinic was unlike any Jack had ever experienced. The air was fresh with the scent of blooming flowers. The city streets less crowded than usual, as if the entire neighborhood had taken a collective breath of relief. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him. The storm had passed and the storming winds of revenge had calmed. His bond with Buddy was stronger than ever, and he felt ready to move forward, knowing that their past had been left behind them finally. As Jack walked Buddy through the quiet streets of Brooklyn Heights, his mind wandered to the events that had led him to this point. It wasn't just about the bikers or the chaos they had brought into his life. It wasn't about the moment when he had stood face to face with Vince, when time had seemed to slow down and the weight of his anger had been just as heavy as the threat he had faced. No, it was about something much deeper. The bond he shared with Buddy had brought him clarity that had been missing for so long. As they made their way down the street, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Hank. Hank, the investigation is moving fast. The bikers will be facing serious charges. The bar owner's under investigation too. You did good, Jack. Jack couldn't help but smile. The justice he had fought for was now within reach for everyone involved. Vince and his gang were not only facing charges for animal cruelty, but for trafficking, assault, and multiple other crimes. The bar was being shut down and the community was finally safe. Hank had promised him that his involvement would remain discreet, and so far he had kept that promise. The quiet victory of justice was a sweet one. Still, Jack couldn't deny the weight of the days ahead. The truth was, he didn't know how life would unfold once the dust settled. Would things return to normal? Or would they change forever, as all big moments in life tend to do? Just then, Buddy gave a low whine, pulling Jack out of his thoughts. The dog looked up at him, his eyes sparkling with an unspoken question. Jack chuckled softly, ruffling Buddy's head. "You ready for a new adventure, Buddy?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. Buddy's tail wagged eagerly, his body pressing close to Jack's leg as they continued their walk. It was clear that Buddy trusted him completely, just as Jack now trusted Buddy in ways he couldn't have imagined just a few days ago. Buddy had been through so much. The poisoning, the chase to save him, the tense standoff at the warehouse. It had been a long, hard road for both of them. But now there was peace. Now there was calm. As they reached a small park by the river, Jack sat down on a bench, Buddy curling up next to him. The gentle sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the distant hum of the river's current. Jack leaned back, breathing in the fresh air, his thoughts once again returning to his journey. He'd never wanted to become a man of violence, of revenge, but sometimes life had a way of pushing you to that edge. And yet, even after all the chaos, the confrontations, and the narrow escapes, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the simple truth. He had done it to protect someone he cared about. Buddy. In that moment, Jack realized that what had started as a responsibility, a favor to the film set, had evolved into something far more profound. He wasn't just a man with a dog anymore. He was a protector, a fighter, and Buddy was no longer just a companion in his journey to play a role on screen. Buddy had become his anchor, his partner in a life far more real than any script. As the day wore on, Jack and Buddy took a slow stroll back to their apartment. It was a quiet walk filled with unspoken words between man and dog. As they reached the front door of Jack's apartment building, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the film production team. "Jack, it's the producer. Just wanted to check in and see how Buddy is doing." The producer's voice came through the phone, warm and concerned. "He's recovering well." "The vet said he'll be fully back to normal in a couple of days," Jack replied, leaning against the door frame, glancing down at Buddy. "That's great to hear," the producer said with relief. "We've decided to move forward with the schedule. Your scenes with Buddy will be reshot once he's fully recovered. Take your time, but we're excited to have him back on set." Jack felt a surge of gratitude. The producer's understanding meant the world to him. It wasn't just about the movie, it was about Buddy's health. And the fact that they were giving Buddy the time he needed to heal was a gesture Jack would never forget. As he ended the call, he looked down at Buddy again. "Looks like we're back in action soon, huh?" he said with a chuckle. Buddy barked, wagging his tail. Jack's heart swelled with pride. Together they would face whatever came next. The following days were a blur of routine. Jack spent time with Buddy, making sure he was well cared for and rested. He checked in with the police every day to ensure Vince's gang was being properly prosecuted, and Hank kept him informed of every development in the case. But more than anything, Jack focused on his connection with Buddy. The bond they shared was deepening every day, and it was clear that Buddy was no longer just a character in a film. It was Jack's real companion, the one who had stood by him when things were at their darkest. One morning, about a week after the final confrontation, Jack received a call from Hank. This time, there was no delay in the conversation. Hank's voice was direct and serious. "The trial's starting soon," Hank said. "Vince and the others are looking at long sentences. I know this has been hard for you, but justice is going to be served." Jack took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I know. I just want to make sure Buddy's okay." Everything else seemed so small next to him. "You did good," Hank replied. "You stood up for what's right and you protected your own. That's more than most people ever do." Jack smiled softly. "Thanks, Hank." As Jack hung up the phone, he looked over at Buddy, who was lying comfortably on the couch. Buddy's eyes met his, and Jack felt a deep connection to the dog, one that transcended words. There had been a time not so long ago when Jack thought he had everything figured out. He thought his life was about playing the role of the protector on screen. But now, with Buddy by his side, he realized that real life wasn't about acting. It was about the connections we make, the people and animals we choose to protect, and the love we give and receive. As Jack stood up to make his way to the door, Buddy followed him, tail wagging, eyes bright. It was time to go back to the set. But this time, it wasn't just about work, it was about Buddy. It was about a new beginning, a future filled with trust, love, and the kind of loyalty that could never be broken. Together, they had faced their darkest moments. Now it was time to walk into the light. Jack opened the door and looked down at Buddy. "You ready, pal?" Buddy barked enthusiastically, as if to say, "Let's go." And together they stepped into the future.